Welcome to Oshawa Public Library's Local History Spotlight. My name is Nicole Adams, and I'm the Genealogy and Local History Librarian for the Oshawa Public Libraries. I'm thrilled this evening to welcome Ron Brown as our featured speaker. We have a large number of people attending, so everyone but Ron will be listening in listen-only mode, and you can ask questions using the chat feature, and then I will read those out at the end of the presentation, and Ron will be able to answer. Also, the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel within a few days. So everyone in this group probably knows Ron. CBC once said about him, nobody knows Ontario like Ron Brown. He's an author, geographer, and travel writer. His travel pieces have been published in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, Canadian Geographic Magazine, and Via Rail Magazine. He has over 5,000 images. Stock photo inventory includes views of Toronto, lesser known landscapes, with a specialization in historic buildings, main streets, railway stations, which we're talking about this evening, and ghost towns. He has many books we have in the library, and he has available for purchase as well, including Rails Across Ontario, Backroads of Ontario, Ontario's Ghost Town Heritage, and a recently revised Toronto's Lost Villages. And today he'll be speaking about his popular book, The Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore, an illustrated history of the train station in Canada's history. And now I will turn it over to Ron.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. I hope you've crawled out from under your bed and have your mask on, as I have. This stunning image here is not George Clooney, but the resemblance is uncanny. It is myself, and I'm looking at you guys, and we're going to talk tonight about The Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore. Actually, it's going to be a bit more than that. It's going to be more about a journey across Canada, and we're going to learn about our various, the way we've preserved or not preserved, as the case may be, our railway. Well, when we first arrived, Europeans, I should say, first began to intrude on Turtle Island, as the indigenous people like to call it. Traveling was a bit of a challenge. First Nations people used their canoes. We weren't used to canoes, so we brought in our horses and wagons and followed whatever paths we could. Most of our early transportation was by water or by stagecoach, and that was a bit cumbersome as well, because both water and stagecoach travel was seasonal and slow. It could take you 5 days to get from Toronto to York, as it was called, to Kingston by stage. So no problem that the people began to welcome the railways to our landscape. Railways began in England in the 1820s and began to come to Canada in the 1830s. The first railways we had were actually those of the of Cape Breton. The Cape Breton railways hauled coal from Cape Breton lines to the ports at Lunenburg. Not Lunenburg, I'm sorry, Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. The first passenger service was found on the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway in the 1840s from Montreal down through Maine to the Atlantic ports. The railways in central Canada began mostly as portage railways. In other words, railways which linked one body of water to another. And here we see a portage railway known as the Midland Railway, which ran through Peterborough, Ontario, and that's the old Grand Trunk Station. Railway builders began to come on the scene as well. John Rudolphus Booth built an immense railway network. He was the richest railway builder in the 1890s in all of North America. And he managed to build a railway line connecting Portland, Maine, all the way across Ontario to a place called Depot Harbor, which no longer exists. The CPR, of course, came along and built their transcontinental line, which opened in 1886. And here we see the Canadian along the shores of Lake Superior. The Grand Trunk Railway is a name which most of us may know as well from our historical research. But it was an English railway and built a line from Nova Scotia through to Sarnia. The eastern portion was known as the Intercolonial Railway, so it was really the first transnational railway line in Canada. Most of its railway stations looked something like this, a model of an English railway station We see this one in Ernestown. It built 38 of these buildings between Montreal and Sarnia. 8 remain, and including the one in Port Hope, actually, is an example of this particular station. Along came a railway line which some of us may have never heard of, and that was called the Canadian Northern Railway, put together by 2 enterprising entrepreneurs named William Mackenzie and Donald Mann. And what they did was they cobbled together a bunch of unused charters or unused railway lines and built a network from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all on their own. And here we see the Canadian Northern Station in Port Hope. Some of you may know it as the Ministry of Transportation building on Ontario Street. Well, railway building was definitely a challenge to go through the various tunnels and mountains of northern Ontario and the Rockies. Well, railway lines also began to make their way from the transcontinental lines, CN, CP, and so on, into northern parts of the country. And a number of parish, I should say, in Quebec decided that their farmland areas were getting too crowded to enlarge their flocks, so they promoted railways into northern Quebec. This particular line went north from Montreal through St. Agathe into the Laurentians and all the way up to Mont Laurier in Quebec. Another industrial line, not so much a passenger line or a colonization line, was the Quebec North Shore and Labrador, which made its way up to iron mines of northern Quebec, Labrador City, and those places like that. This particular engine is one of the former steam engines from that line, preserved in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. Well, the railways had a tremendous impact on our landscapes as well. In many cases where the railways owned the land, they would divide the land into a grid network of streets. We see that in northern Ontario, also in the prairies. And here's a good example in Outlook, Saskatchewan, where we see the main street ending dutifully at the railway station. The railways also had a major impact concerning divisional points. Now, divisional points were where trains got assembled and maintenance was taken care of and crews changed shifts and so on. Very large yards, and they spawned quite large towns in some cases. Here we see the Divisional Yard in Hamilton, Divisional Yard in East Toronto. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this area, but this is the view off the Main Street Bridge, or at least it was. Up until a few years ago, this entire area is now condominiums. What a surprise, eh, people? Well, divisional points didn't necessarily have to be big as well. The Big Valley Station in Alberta was actually a railway divisional point. Just off to the left, a very small building, is the old railway roundhouse. The yards are all taken up, and it's now the destination of an excursion train, a steam excursion train in Alberta. Quite wonderful. Well, like I say, the stations for divisional points don't have to be big. This one is still operating in Lanigan, Saskatchewan. And I want to point out the remarkable style here. It's known as the Chinese pagoda style. You can see by the curvature on the roof where it got that name. A few of these are still around in Saskatchewan, but we'll talk about railway station demolitions a little bit. Well, part and parcel of the railway landscape too were the hotels, which were built usually right behind the railway stations. In this particular case, we're in Medicine Hat, Alberta. Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, I'm sorry, where there is an entire row of hotels on a street called River Street. Well, quite appropriately, the city designated the entire row of hotels as a heritage district and then allowed them to be demolished by a developer. What's there now? A parking lot. What else is new, eh, folks? Some hotels were a little bit grander than others. This is the Vigier Hotel, or Vigier Station and Hotel in Montreal. It was a combined station and hotel, built chateau style, as the CP loved to do. Trains came in from the back portion of this building, and the hotel rooms were on the upper floors. The last I saw, it was vacant. What a shame. Another one which is not so vacant, you may have seen this on Still Standing with Johnny Harris, was the beautiful station in Macadam, New Brunswick. This was a CPR, classic CPR chateau style station with a hotel on the top floors and station facilities, including dining rooms and hotel lobby and a jail as well, because this was very close to the U.S. border. And, you know, you get all these drunken Americans, we just toss them in the jail when they get off the train. Well, Macadam, New Brunswick, sort of in the middle of the province, in the middle of the woods. So why on earth would this particular station be located there? Because there was a link from, this was, I should say, on CPR's main line to the Atlantic from Montreal. This was a branch line which led off to St. Andrews by the Sea and the CPR's beautiful Algonquin Inn Hotel. So passengers switching trains to go down to that location would spend their nights in luxury at this beautiful hotel. Macadam has a population of 500, and they've taken it upon themselves to restore this station. The dining room has been restored, the hotel lobby has been restored, the rooms upstairs, not so much yet. And they're doing it all from locally raised funds. The building is a National Historic Site. Not quite as grand as the Station Hotel and Station, actually, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Scotia Hotel is on the left, and it's attached to that low gray building on the right, which is the CN Station, built following the terrific Halifax explosion in 1917. CPR got into station or hotel building in a big way to take advantage of their wonderful natural assets in the Rocky Mountains, where they built the Banff Springs Hotel and this one, the Chateau Lake Louise, one of their beautiful buildings. And of course in Ottawa, we have the Chateau Laurier Hotel. This was started by Charles Melville Hayes, who was president of the Canadian Northern Railway, as we mentioned, Grand Trunk Railway, and it was scheduled to open in the fall of 1912, just as soon as Charles Melville Hayes arrived in Canada on board the Titanic. That's right. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. His wife and daughter did, and the hotel opened on schedule. And in Toronto, we have the Grand Old Royal York Hotel. It's not an oldish building. It goes from about 1928 and built to connect to the beautiful Toronto Union Station via an underground tunnel. I'll tell you about the stories of the Union Station in a few minutes' time. Most station hotels were more or less like this. This is the King George Hotel in the divisional town way up in northern Ontario of Armstrong. I don't know what kind of shape that thing is in now. It didn't look in great shape at the time. Unfortunately, the Armstrong Station, although it was designated heritage building, is no longer there. Now, in order to make accommodations more reasonable for train crews rather than Armstrong here, a little bit rough and ready, the YMCA, in conjunction with both the Grand Trunk Railway and the CPR in the 1890s, decided to erect a series of railway YMCAs across the country. There were 48 of them. They're all gone, except this one in Allendale, which is the south side of Barrie, right across from the Allendale station. Somehow it managed to hang around, I guess, because they put it into a pub. I think the train crews would have been quite happy for that. But at divisional points, railway crews also were able to be housed in housing. Here we are in Scriber, Ontario, another feature on the Johnny Harris still standing. Don't mind me just taking a slip of water here. It is really water. And railway housing looked exactly like this, all railway housing in Scriber. Out along the line, things were a little different, though. The section crews had to live in something more modest, buildings like this, which is on a remote section of the CN Via railway line in Quebec. That's now the focus of a local lodge. Well, what did the railway barons themselves use for accommodation? Like this. This is yet known as Yates Castle. It's located in Brantford, Ontario, built by Henry who promoted the building of a railway between Buffalo and Goderich. And they're still there. The castle is still there, but the tracks are all now CN tracks. Well, railway stations are probably the most visible of our railway heritage. This one you may not recognize, not many people do. It was one of the first stations to be built in Montreal by the CPR. It's called the Dalhousie Station, and it was here that Cirque du Soleil actually got their start by practicing in the large waiting room, which the large windows down at the lower level. Well, the CPR decided it would amalgamate all its little stations into a bit bigger, and here we see the Windsor Station in Montreal. Beautiful building. William Van Horn, president of the CPR, called it the best station in all of creation. And it sure as heck was. In fact, you don't even see all of the building here. Today, since most of the CPR staff are in Calgary, the building is vacant. The interior of the station is quite dramatic as well, and commuter trains actually call here, so people do wander back and forth. Two businesses still operating there. Well, throughout Canada, stations were built in a tremendously innovative style. The Canadian Northern had this typical pyramid roof style station, in fact, all across the prairies. Interesting why? Well, if you look at the top there, it's a very high pointed roof. And that was because you could see these stations from a great distance across the prairies. That was the intention of the pyramid roof. The CPR built some grand chateau-style stations from western part of Ontario across the prairies. This is the structure in Saskatoon. It's now, not surprisingly, a pub and tavern. Well, most of the prairie stations looked something like this, very simple. This is a nicely preserved railway heritage landscape at Glasland, Saskatchewan, complete with a wooden water tower. Now inside that tower, down at the bottom, the water tank was on top, of course. It was enclosed to prevent the water from freezing, and inside that enclosure was the pumps. Now you may be able to see on the roof kind of a little ball on the top of a pole. This is on the roof of the water tower. That ball showed you the level of the water inside the tower. If the ball was low down, that means the water level was low. If the ball was at the top, the water level was full. The inside of some of these stations provided accommodation for the station agent and his family. This is a preserved example in Saskatchewan. But many stations, alas, were not very elaborate at all. In fact, a great proportion of them across the prairies and in parts of Ontario were simply prefabricated little stations that you could put on the top of a flat car, move it to where you want it, and plop it down by the tracks. This is in Pence, Saskatchewan. Now, American railways had a little bit of a different approach to their stations. In fact, one of their prominent station architects was a guy named H.H. Richardson, who was quite effective in building a unique style of stations. Operator's bay window in the center there is actually rounded. The freight door is a rounded stone as well. This is in Essex, Ontario, and preserved as a museum. Again, a beautiful example of what American station architects can bring to the province. There weren't very many of them. The only other one of this style is actually in Kingsville, Ontario. Well, in the 1890s, the Grand Trunk decided it was going to enlarge its railway operations, and it enlarged some of its stations. One of its fetishes was to plop large towers on some of their station buildings. We find this in a few places in Ontario, and especially on the Grand Trunk line where it ran through southern Michigan. This is Brantford, Ontario. The water tower, or the center tower there, served absolutely no purpose. I guess the station agent could go up there and play a game of cards with the train crew. I'm not quite sure what they used it for anyway. But let's get back to the prairies or the Rockies for a while, and the CPR was quite effective in building lovely stations compatible with the scenery. This is the CPR station in Banff, Alberta. the trains no longer stop there except for the Rocky Mountaineer. That's no longer used for regular passenger service, sadly. Just on the track, we have the station at Lake Louise. A few stations built by the CPR in Western Canada were made of log. The station is a designated heritage site and is a popular restaurant. Very lovely. Well, the CPR didn't want to be outdone by CPR's station building, so they had a park known as Jasper Park Lodge, and they decided they would erect a much larger station than they had previously at Jasper, and the waiting room is 2 stories high with a stone fireplace. Just a beautiful building, and VIA actually still stops there on its route to Vancouver and also on its Skeena route to Prince Rupert. Entering Quebec, this looks very typical of Quebec-style architecture, and that was the whole idea. In 1938, the Delaware and Hudson built this station on its entry point into Quebec. It was a customs office. Trains would stop there, and the passengers would look in awe at the wonderful architecture they were about to see in the province of Quebec. It's vacant now and by the municipality. Well, Toronto's Union Station. We all, I think, have traveled out of there at some point or another, and it has a bit of a to it as well, don't they all? In 1904, much of the downtown area of Toronto burned down, and what that did was allow a very large vacant piece of land for a new Union Station. The older one was obsolete, was crowded. So in 1904, the City Council decided, okay, we'll build a station on this land. Well, the years went by, as happens here in Toronto, and they dithered and dithered over who was going to design. Finally, in 1916, they had a design, and so they started to build the station. But then there was another problem. Where should the tracks go? Now, there are 2 types of stations they could have come up with. It was called a stub station, which means the tracks all end at the station, or a through station, where the tracks would go through the station and people would get on and go one way or the other. Okay, that was fine. They settled on a through station, and then came the problem, well, should the crossings of the roads be level or raised? In other words, the roads go under them. Well, that took a little while to resolve as well. Finally, after starting the planning process in 1904, the station opened in 1927. Welcome to Toronto. Well, many of the urban stations had grand interiors as well. This is not the interior of the station, this is the interior of the Canadian Pacific Station in Vancouver. The station is still used for commuter lines in that city, and much of the interior has been lovingly restored. Well, let's turn our attention to the post-war years. Most of the grand stations were built before the Second World War. Well, things became a lot more practical after the war ended, and what few stations were built then were built in a more like a practical style. This was known as an Art Deco style with the wraparound canopy and the flat roof. This is the CPR station in Owen Sound, Ontario. During the time it stood vacant. Now, like many stations have become, it is a bar and pub. A similar style of station is found out in Field, BC, a much more attractive one with the stonework on its base. Field, BC is a very interesting old railway town. If you get a chance, drive around. A lot of historic buildings there. Well, Canadian National decided they would get in the Modernization Act as well, and realized that some of their downtown stations were impractical with the coming of the car era, and so they built this particular station a little bit outside the urban area. Some of you may remember this as being the CN's new Oshawa station. A little bit different now, I think you know that. VIA got in the act too by building a brand new station in downtown London, Ontario. Kind of evoked the old image of the station tower. Again, totally useless, but you know, it kind of evokes the history of the building. Well, along came the cars era. Beginning in the 1920s, people began to fall in love with the car. And in 1939, you may recognize this as being the Queen Elizabeth Way, opened between Toronto and St. Catharines originally and extended eventually to Fort Erie. The car era took over, railway lines were abandoned and torn up. Ontario lost 80% of its trackage following through the 1960s, even up to the present day. And that process is still out in the prairies where many branch lines are being abandoned as well. It was an era too when stations came tumbling down. This is the demolition of the Streetcar station in Thunder Bay. But it was with the demolition of the Canadian Pacific station at West Toronto in 1982 that outraged citizens, and they lobbied their parliamentarians to pass a Railway Station Protection Act, which eventually they did, and today over 300 stations are protected under the Station Protection Act. Two remaining stations in Thunder Bay both fall under that protection. Well, like I say, the road network began to take over. Highway blasting was rampant in northern Ontario, and you had to come to a stop just to allow that blasting to continue there. Well, another icon of our railway heritage were, of course, the water towers. I mentioned that a little bit earlier on in connection with Glasgow, Saskatchewan. And here we see a water tower example in Manitoba. Again, the ball is right down to the bottom, which means the tank is empty. In Ontario, we only have one wooden water tower left, and that's in Barry's Bay. They've done a beautiful job of preserving this without its opposition, but it still stands there very close to the Barry's Bay train station and the Barry's Bay Station Hotel. Well, roundhouses too are kind of a lost sheep in a way. They're not very practical in terms of preservation. They're in odd locations on a railway yard. They're not close to anything much. But the John Street Roundhouse in downtown Toronto has managed to become preserved with the Steam Whistle Brewery, the water tower, and a railway station or a railway museum with all kinds of unusual railway cars. It's quite worth a visit if you haven't been there yet. And it should be opening up in stage 3, I imagine. Not all roundhouses managed to get preserved, like I say, because they were in weird locations. The Lambton Roundhouse, owned by the CPR in the west end of the city, a lot of people thought this should be preserved. It was a very historic part of the CP's crosstown line. But alas, CPR wasn't interested in preserving their heritage, and so it came down to be replaced by, and guess what, a big box store. So it's no longer. But small roundhouses, this is actually a 2-bay roundhouse, are being preserved. Interestingly enough, this is in Valley Junction, Quebec, sorry. And you can see it's been well preserved and is part of an overall rail display in that particular town. And now, who's ever heard of a square roundhouse? Probably nobody. This is the divisional town, still busy divisional town of Hornpain, Ontario. You can see a few things here. The station is on the left-hand side. It's been designated as a heritage station, but still it's undergoing what's called demolition by neglect. Nobody is taking care of it. In the top center, you can see a coal chute, which again is a vanishing landmark railways, but in the upper right, you'll see a large flat building with a silver roof. That is a square roundhouse. Well, why would a roundhouse be? Quite simply, think of how cold it gets in Hornpain and places like that in the wintertime. Well, the turntables and all the other mechanical devices are inside the building to prevent them from freezing solid in the midst of the winter. That one in Hornpain is no longer in use as a roundhouse, but it's being maintained. I can't tell you what they're being used for at this moment. Another roundhouse, which is actually still in use, is in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. One of the oldest roundhouses and engine houses in Ontario is that at Carleton Place. It was built by the CPR in the 1880s And inside this wool grower's warehouse, you can actually still see some of the trackage. The roundhouse is off to the left of it. Out in BC, the Victoria Roundhouse is now being preserved as part of a development. At least they didn't tear it down. It's a very historic building, the last large wooden roundhouse in the country. Well, bridges too often go unappreciated. The railways built some of the most magnificent bridge structures in the world, in fact. And this some of you may recognize on the Agua Canyon tour train as a bridge over the Montreal River. But many bridges are quite stunning. The bridge very close to home here is the trestle at Port Hope. This goes back to the 1860s and still has trains rumbling across it, several a day. The only example of a stone arch railway bridge in Canada is that at Napanee. Stone arch bridges were very common in England and in parts of the northeastern US. This, however, is the only example of a stone arch bridge in Canada. Wooden trestles. Now, not too many of them left simply because they burn or get replaced or fall down from rot. We have one in Paisley, Ontario, still around, but it's no longer do trains go across it. It's a rail trail. And this is an unusual old-timer. It's in the Drumheller Valley in Alberta, and it's a wooden truss bridge. Now, a truss bridge is different from an ordinary bridge, different from a trestle bridge, because the supporting structure is above the railway deck and not below it. So that's what's basically holding the tracks up. It's been long abandoned. It's a historic site, but again, nobody seems to want to take any interest in preserving it. This is an unusual old bridge. It's called a Bascule Bridge, and if you look at it, the bridge portion on the left is held up in the air by the big block thing on the right, which is filled with cement. And that cement block weighs about as much as the bridge itself. And so it's a very easy job, it's not a heavy job at all, to raise and lower the bridge, simply by moving the block. Well, we also have a haunted bridge, or haunted, I'm going from bridges to tunnels now, sorry. This tunnel in St. Catharines is considered to be a haunted. It was a Great Western Bridge which went under the Welland Canal, and because of an accident there, it is said a fatal accident. It is said to be haunted, and people from what's called Hamilton Paranormal go there and they take pictures, and their pictures show wisps of smoke and blobs, white blobs on the camera lens. Well, folks, the white blobs are because they didn't clean the camera lens, and the wisps of smoke are from, well, you know what that's from as well, so they can see ghosts a little bit better. Well, Brockville also has a railway tunnel which goes under the street, under the town hall. And it's a tourist attraction. It's been opened up, and it's kind of lit with moving lights and sounds of steam trains going back and forth. Something we don't appreciate too much either is something, the little bits and pieces of railway buildings that you don't normally think about, called a switching tower. And it's down by the Steam Whistle Brewery Roundhouse, the John Street Roundhouse in Roundhouse Park. And what they did they had probably 20 or 30 levers which moved the tracks back and forth so that the trains wouldn't bump into each other while they were shuffling around in the railway yards. An icon beloved by Western Canadians, of course, is the grain elevator. Grain elevators aren't in much use anymore. Excuse me, I'm just going to take another drink of water here. These grain elevators in Davidson, Saskatchewan, not a single one remains. 80% of the Prairie's grain elevators are gone now, sad to say. But here in Ontario, we actually have a grain elevator. Preserved, Pontypool, Ontario. Well, grain elevators were common here up until about the 1880s or 90s, when grain growing moved west, and most of our grain elevators were replaced at that particular time. There's only about a half dozen still around in Ontario, and this one at Pontypool is probably the most typical of a grain elevator. A nice example of a railway preservation landscape in Rowley, Alberta, also known as Rowleywood. Now, this particular community is a ghost town. Yes, it is. And Hollywood movie makers often go there because of the abandoned buildings on the main street. And once again, I'm a great fan of Johnny Harris and still standing this particular community in his particular show. But again, this going back to our railway station styles, you can see the pyramid roof, which means it's a typical Canadian station. Well, some stations just don't make it in a ghost town. This is Mowbray, Manitoba, very close to the American border. This is an old CPR station, privately owned, but not that well maintained. And just a few meters behind me, in a field, unidentified, is the border. Good thing I didn't have to step too far back to take this particular picture, right? Or I might not be here now. Well, ghost towns became quite common as the branch lines, especially at west, were abandoned. This is a place called Govan, Saskatchewan. It had a busy railway line, but you can see the main street is pretty well vanishing. I don't think those buildings are there anymore, to be honest with you. Yack, British Columbia, also a busy station stop at one point. It has degenerated into pretty much a ghost town as well. Another nice example of a ghost town in Alberta. In Ontario, yeah, we have them here too, but for different reasons. Jackfish, Ontario. It served many roles. It was a very well protected port, or harbor I should say, on the north shore of Lake Superior. So it attracted fishermen, which you can see in the foreground, and the CPR, which built a coal dock here because of the protected harbor. This picture was taken in the 1890s. The coal dock, of course, was demolished in the 1950s when coal was never used. Fishing became impossible due to the invasion of the sea lamprey, which decimated most of the fishing stock. And today, jackfish, like that. Same angle, same picture. Well, how do we try to protect and preserve our railway heritage? Well, we can start operating tour trains, for example. That's a good way to do it. The timber train here operated for a number of years between Mattawa and Temiskaming, Quebec. It was in the 1990s, it was considered Ontario's best new tourist attraction and won an award for that. 10 years later, it was gone. Why? Because it was in Mattawa, Ontario. And the train would normally leave on its excursion at 8 o'clock in the morning, return about 4 in the afternoon. Unfortunately, Mattawa is about 2 hours from the nearest hotel accommodation. And it's going to be hard to get a lot of people to the train from the nearest hotel accommodation for 8 in the morning. Not a problem in Sault Ste. Marie with the Agawam train because the hotels are within walking distance of their station, but this train just couldn't make it, I guess, because of marketing. And Mattawa, again, back to Johnny Harris, was featured on Still Standing a few episodes back. Some regular service has been disrupted as well. The Via Rail's beautiful train excursion out the Gas Peninsula served Quebecers who had their summer homes along that route, and was also one of the most beautiful train rides in eastern Canada, going as it does along the rocky shoreline of the Gaspé Peninsula. Unfortunately, the tracks were owned by, and still are, owned by Canadian National, who are not too inclined to maintain their tracks if they don't have any freight business on it, which was the case here. So at the moment, the Gaspé train is officially, quote, suspended. We really don't know if it's going to get back on track or not. The Canadian Spectacular route, the Canadian train, along the north shore of Lake Superior, was eliminated when CP lobbied the government of Brian Mulroney to move the passenger train further inland to northern Ontario. So we no longer experience this beautiful scenic train ride. And now this is one of the peeves, is the Northlander, one of the most historic train routes in Ontario, running from Toronto straight north to Cochrane, allowing you to go real cross-country, cross-section of Ontario's scenery in historic towns and villages. In 2012, our government of Dalton McGuinty, he was going to try to sell the Ontario Northland Railway to the CNR. CNR don't like passenger trains on their tracks, so Mr. McGuinty discontinued the Northlander. It served people in the north, students, seniors, vacationers, and so on. But not too certainly, the CNR wasn't interested anyway. And so they abandoned their effort to purchase the line, but the Northlander still hasn't been restored to service, much to the chagrin of just about everybody along them. Tour trains like the Wakefield steam excursion discontinued because the tracks were poor and the local municipalities didn't wish to repair the tracks. Many of you may have been on the Credit Valley Flyer, which followed the spectacular gorge of the Credit Valley, Credit River, Orangeville down to Brampton. It was discontinued about 3 years ago because the operator was told that the owner of the tracks would no longer be maintaining them. The train is gone, the tracks are still there. What a surprise. However, let's look at some bit of good news, okay, as we finish the slideshow. If you want a real railway experience, go to the Halton Radial Streetcar Museum near Guelph. It started in the 1950s as an effort to preserve TTC vehicles. Now has some 60-odd pieces of rolling stock, including one of these radial streetcars operated between various cities in Ontario and Canada. The South Simcoe Heritage Railway operates on only about 14 kilometers of track. They'd originally planned to go from Tottenham to Barrie, but the politicians along the way decided they didn't want the smoke from steam engines sullying the laundry that the ladies along the route had put in their backyard. So it was truncated at Beaton, and that's a bit sad, but it does continue to operate some of the oldest operating steam locomotives in the. And closer to home, we have the York and Durham Heritage Railway, which pounded its last spike. I think this was taken in 1998. I should know, I was there. And still operates a lovely train excursion. I don't know if it's currently operating, to be honest with you, from Stouffville up to Uxbridge. No steam locomotives on this one, but it's a vintage diesel and vintage railway coaches as well. And a heritage train station still standing in the Agawam Canyon train, of course, still functions, although the local train doesn't, again, thanks to our good friends at CNR who don't want passenger trains along their rail lines. The Polar Bear Express is actually still functioning because it has to serve remote local communities. It's a necessary service between Cochrane and Moosonee since there's no road. Speaking of no roads, let's venture into northern Quebec, where we have a train route called the Abitibi. It runs 3 times a week from Radial all the way up into the far reaches of northern Quebec. It's a via service, takes all day to get up there, and this particular crowd is gathered at the train as it pulls into a town called Perrant. Perrant has 700 people and no road access, which is why the train is so important along that line. The Canadian, of course, many people don't realize or accept that it's in fact still running. Mind you, it doesn't run from Montreal to Vancouver anymore. It runs from Toronto through Edmonton and out to Vancouver that way. Another unusual line is the Caribou, which runs from Sudbury up to White River. And it's still going on CP tracks and offers not a real scenic one, but one way to celebrate the railway heritage is get active. And here we see the local hand carving place at Palmerston, Ontario. Cranbrook, BC has a museum full of vintage train sets, entire train sets from the 1920s and 30s. While out in Vancouver at the Yale Roundhouse, we have preserved the very first steam engine that hauled the first train across Canada from Montreal to Vancouver. nicely preserved. Another way to preserve our railway heritage is putting murals on the wall. This is a mural of a streetcar line along the Kingston Road in Scarborough. And Athens was one of the first communities in Ontario to use outdoor wall murals as a way to attract visitors to their town. This is unusual. It's the school car which once ran through northern Ontario from the 1920s to the 1960s. It would stop at various sidings along the way to give the kids their school lessons. And Fred Sloman operated that school car for 42 years, the entire duration of its route, and is now preserved in Clinton, Ontario, the hometown of Fred Sloman. And here we see standing on the entrance to the school car. Well, Winnie the Pooh is an icon at White River. Why? Well, it used to be the coldest thermometer here. Winnie the Pooh was found as a bear cub in the platform of the White River Station during the First World War. Named after the hometown of the captain who purchased him, Winnipeg, took him to England, where he became nicknamed Winnie. Winnie was the favorite of Christopher Robin Milne, whose father, A.A. Milne, used that inspiration to write his books, Winnie the Pooh. Well, we're closing in on the show tonight, and we're going to finish off by telling you ways you can actually get out and physically enjoy our railway heritage. You can follow rail trails such as the Georgian Trail from Collingwood to Meaford. Or you can follow the old Kingston and Pembroke Trail. Well, maybe not all that easy. It's kind of more of a utility trail, which floods quite often and has lumber trucks running along it. I'm not sure if you want to use that one or not. Some stations have unusual uses. The station preserved at Fredericton, now a liquor store. The Hamilton CN station, rescued by Wood, interesting enough, from its rundown state, and is now an event venue and often used as a movie set. Station in Regina, now a casino. And this station kind of touches the heartstrings a bit. It is one of the few buildings to survive a train wreck and train blast in Lac-Mégantic, which destroyed most of the downtown. It's ironic indeed that one of the few buildings to survive was the CP train station. Pier 21 station here was where people got on board from the ships destined for their properties in Canada and would board the trains here to take them west. The station museum in St. John's, Newfoundland decided to put a couple of dummies on display in a cross-section of a rail car at their station. And Megan Follows, Anna Green Gables, this is not a real station, folks. It is not in Prince Edward Island. It's a replica station built at the Dundas Valley Conservation Area west of Hamilton as a trailhead. It, however, is an exact replica of the former Grand Trunk Station, which stood in Grimsby. Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation today, and we're going to take a look at some of the scenes we might see from a train if we got on board to this day. So enjoy the train rides that you can still get, folks, and happy voyage, and please stay safe. And that's the end of our show tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron. We do have a couple of questions that came in while you were speaking. And
Okay.
I can read some of those out to you, and you can sort of take care of those. Early on, Patrick had put a question in saying, what date was the picture taken at Ernesttown? There was a picture taken at the Ernesttown station.
Sorry, which town?
Ernesttown?
Sorry, I didn't get that entirely.
Ernesttown? That's what he typed anyway. Is it Ernesttown?
Oh, Ernesttown.
Yeah, Ernesttown.
Yeah, it's not very recent, as you know. Ernesttown is in a little bit shabby condition now. That was probably taken in the 1990s. Still in good shape then. But it's only used for storage. Sorry, go ahead.
Another question was, is the water tower in Blythe, Ontario, a wooden one?
The Blythe Tower is a steel one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now standing beside a rail trail in Blythe. The Blythe station is still around. It was moved just down the road a bit, and I think it last Last I saw was an antique store.
Ted had a question about your feelings about high-speed trains, 250 kilometers per hour and even higher. What do you think about that? Like magnetic elevated rail tracks and such, like high-speed trains?
Well, I guess my own opinion, I'm not an expert on high-speed trains by any means. I enjoy rail travel, and I enjoy a nice leisurely train ride, but that's just me. I think the population density we have in our country doesn't warrant real high-speed trains. If you go to high-speed trains, people are going to say, well, heck, we'll take a plane. Trains, I think, serve not just point A to point B, it's in between. And in that way, you know, high-speed rail probably is just going to go rushing through those particular points. I believe there's a proposal by Via Rail currently to reopen an old railway line which ran from Ottawa down through Havelock and Peterborough and on down to Toronto. The portion east of Havelock has been long abandoned, but they're, I think, proposing to relay tracks and make that a high-speed rail route. I still haven't seen the business case for it, but it'll be interesting to see how that one ends. So those are my thoughts. I think rail service serves people not just from point A to point B, but those in between as well.
There was, oh, sorry, Ted had posted high frequency rail, not high speed rail. Maybe.
Is that not the same thing? High frequency?
I don't know.
Increased frequency. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we need increased
High frequency rail. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of train travel has slowed down now with the current lockdowns. People like tourists, seniors, students, they still often require that type of transportation, especially in the wintertime. Trains can get through, your school bus can't. I mean, how many school closures do we read about because of the winter weather? Trains you get through. Anyway, that's just me.
You were mentioning the York-Durham Heritage Railway, and someone had commented that they are actually still in operation.
That's good. Yeah, I'm just wondering if they're still in operation through the current pandemic, that's all. I know they still operate, but I'm just wondering how they're doing these days. Because I think people are limited in the way they can board buses and trains.
Well, I think they've been doing a lot of fundraising. They do auctions. They have a Facebook page I follow that they auction things off to help support the railway.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're back to doing their train tours at this point, but they're hoping to do that soon. It says here, it's operating in survival mode. Someone commented. David is one of the directors. He's in the audience. Well,
I wish them luck. I mean, tour trains and that type of thing are really a live way to visit and enjoy our railway heritage. And I think railways have a really strong role to play in the future as well. Maybe people don't agree with that, but I think they do.
Well, another question would be, which station would be your top priority to preserve?
Oh boy. There's lots. There's one where people are really working to preserve it in Searchmont, Ontario. It's a bit north of Sault Ste. Marie. It's a very distinctive style of station. It's been out of use for quite a number of years now. I think that's an important one to try to preserve. The thing is, a lot of threatened stations just are gone now. You know, those that have been threatened over the years. Those that weren't threatened were designated under the Railway Heritage Station Protection Act, and so there's not too much bad going to happen to them as far as I know. Ernesttown, that came up earlier. I think that would be a good one to work on preserving. It's in pretty rough shape now. One which I guess really angered me as much as the West Toronto Junction station was Kingston's outer station. Beautiful stone, mansard roofed station building. I used to take it go there as a kid to visit my grandparents. They just let it go to rot and ruin. And the roof eventually collapsed. A fire gutted the inside. The stone walls are still there, and Kingston City's council is still muttering about doing something with it. But Kingston City Council, and I'm sorry to say this to anybody who's from Kingston, is very bad at heritage preservation, despite the wonderful heritage buildings that Kingston has. And believe it or not, they're prepared to let Kingston Pen be demolished for condominiums, if you can believe it. Anyway.
Oh, no. As you were mentioning the different railways out west, someone had commented that there's the Kettle Valley Railway out in BC and the Prairie Dog Central in Manitoba.
Oh yeah, those are great railway operations. Prairie Dog Central is often used in making of movies. The Kettle Valley Railway, there's only a portion of it. Actually still has a train running on it down around Somerstown, I believe it is. The Kettle Valley Railway did a lot of great engineering feats. The Maya Canyon trestles, for example, are very popular with cyclists until they get to one of the higher trestles, and one fella said basically they get to that point and then turn around and go back. And the Quintet tunnels just near Hope, BC, are quite remarkable as well. They were carved into sheer granite cliffs, and there's about four of them in a row, which cut through the cliffs as the river bends around those particular rock formations. So that's a very interesting railway line. I'm glad the person brought it up.
Mm-hmm. We're having a lot of great comments coming in saying thank you so much for all the interesting information and the great overview of all the stations. There were some links I shared in the chat for people about the heritage, those that have been designated as heritage railway stations. If anybody wants to check that out, it's through Parks Canada. It's on their website. Mm-hmm. And I had one question for you about the Canadian Northern Railway, which was sort of a failed experiment, was it not?
Yes.
I know they, it was in the 20s, I believe, they were building it. And there was a station in Oshawa, which is where we are, which has then been moved down and is now a home in northern Oshawa.
Right.
From the Canadian Northern Railway. And I think a lot of people in the area aren't really aware that there was a railway that went through the north part of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the building you mentioned is on Wayne Street, I believe. And up near a community called Salina as well, northeast of Oshawa, there's a Canadian Northern train station still on its original site, just south of the village of Salina. And it's you can see it nicely from the road. It's private now. A little bit back from the road, but from the road you can get a reasonably good picture of it if you wanted to. That's Salina. And of course the Canadian Northern Station in Port Hope, Ontario is now, like I mentioned, the site of the Ministry of Transportation office.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have coming in. There's lots of thanks, lots of great job, Ron, and all the detail that you've provided.
Yeah. If anybody wants to know how to purchase that particular book, they could email me at Ron F. Brown, that's F as in Frank, Ron F. Brown at gmail.com. The book normally retails for $30. I will make it available for $25. Unfortunately, I'd have to add postage on top of that because it costs a bit. The presentation also called upon the books like Rails Over the Mountains, Rails Across the Prairies, and Rails to the Atlantic, if people are interested in looking those up. And those are all available through Dundurn Press. And you could check my website, www.ronbrown.ca, and you'll see a list of the books there.
I think someone was asked, oh, that's okay. That's people were asking about the Last Train to Lindsay book and if that's still available.
The Last Train to Lindsay?
Yes.
That wasn't a book which I wrote. Actually, I have a book in my collection called Steam into Lindsay, I think it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That might be what they meant.
Yeah, it's a very large coffee table type book. Very good. Very good.
The person just posted, just realized it wasn't a Ron Brown book. Oops. Obviously, a train enthusiast reads all sorts of books about the train stations. So those books that Ron has for sale, you can check out on his website, and you have to contact him directly. I've put his email address in the chat, but of course, I think they can contact you through your website as well. Your email address is on your website?
Sorry? Your
email address is on your website?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay, I've concluded it in the chat. Also, the Oshawa Library carries, I think, at least a dozen of your books. And you mentioned, yeah, if anybody would like to request them, we do have some of his older titles. And you told me recently, Ron, that your Lost Villages of Toronto has been recently revised.
Yeah, Toronto's Lost Villages, again, a Dundurn publication. Just came out a few months ago.
Mm-hmm. So new and improved, right? Updated.
Well, I hope so.
Well, I think that concludes the questions that are coming in. I want to thank Ron so much for all your information that you provided, and thank you, patience for everybody to keeping going. I knew once we got going, you just got on a roll, so that's amazing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, I want to thank you, Nicole, for your patience in getting me through these computer challenges, which seem to descend on me every time I turn the computer on anyway.
Well, there's worse things to worry about. Everyone in the group was quite patient with that, and they knew they were waiting for something good. So, and you did not disappoint.
Well,
so
thank you
so
for
much.
that.